Hello and welcome back to the studio. Today I am thrilled to give you a tour of my primary watercolor palette. This is a porcelain palette. It is, I believe, 32 wells, but this is the primary palette that I use whenever I'm working on a tutorial. Now, if you're looking at this and you're like, this thing is massive, it's way too big for me, I highly recommend this palette. This is also porcelain. It only has 18 wells or spots for colors, and it's a wonderful size. This honestly is my go-to palette. You can see that I've obviously been using it. I just love it. I love the size. I love the amount of space I have to mix colors in here. I tend to be kind of minimal with my palettes, and I have my go-to colors in here, which are also in this palette, and I will be sure to mention them as we go across them. But I wanted to share with you kind of this option if this is just a better size for you. One thing to know about this palette is that a couple years ago I switched to higher quality pigments, and one of the things that I was focusing on was how light fast a color is. So light fast just has to do with how it resists fading in the light, and so you want a better score for that. So this is transparent yellow. It's one of my top colors, and if you look on the back, so you can find the light fast score as well as the pigment score. So the light fastness, which again is how well it resists light if it's like exposed to any sort of sunlight. This is a 1, which is top. There are also colors on my palette that have a score of a 2, but I've tried to keep it at a 1 or a 2. Anything that's a 3, 4, 5, I don't include on my palette because it's not something I want to deal with my artwork. The other code you'll find on here that I'll also include in this swatch video is the pigment color, the pigment code. So pigment PY150 is the code for transparent yellow. P stands for pigment. Y is kind of the undertone. So it could be PR for a red pigment, PG for a green, PB for a blue, you get the idea. And then the 150 is the pigment code. Now, from what I understand, there's nothing super significant or special about these codes. It just is an identification. If you go up if you go to a higher number, it's not automatically a cooler tone or a warmer tone or a more saturated. It's just kind of how it falls on the chart. So that's my understanding. There's a lot more information about it. There are people out there who totally nerd out about this. I'm not one of them. I just try to understand how to pick good colors. The one thing that I do try to do is try to have the lowest number of pigments within each tube that I get as possible, because it's just a little bit more reliable, because there's just not as much variety or room for error within each individual tube. Sap green is one exception that I do make. Now I usually prefer the Winsor Newton sap green, but I have the Daniel Smith right here, and you can see it's mixed with PO, or an orange pigment, 48, PY, a yellow pigment, 150, which is actually transparent yellow, and PG, a green, 7. So it's probably mostly PG 7 because it is very green. But they use these 3 pigments to mix this color. So, which again isn't a bad thing, but I've just found as an artist, I want to do most of the mixing myself, and so I limit the number of colors that I want in my palette. I do make exceptions, but just a general rule of thumb. First in the palette, we're just going to start at the top and work counterclockwise all the way around. We have yellow ochre. Yellow ochre kind of comes from my background in oil painting, and I used yellow ochre a lot there. So some of my history with that has translated over here. I used it a lot in my previous palette. I don't use it as much lately. I've just found that I don't need it, but I'm glad to have it there in case I want to pull it, because it is one of those that I'll probably always have yellow ochre in my stash. I just might not use it as much. Next up, we have transparent yellow. Now this is one that I have in my smaller palette. It is my very favorite yellow. It's a nice saturated yellow. I love it partially because in a darker format, in a more concentrated format, it is very similar and has a lot of the same undertones as the yellow ochre. But when it's diluted, it's this nice, bright, warm, light yellow that I find is really versatile. I can get a lot of kind of cooler tone looks with it, but it also, with even just a little bit of red, it's very warm and rich. Next up, we have Winsor yellow, and again, this is kind of my neutral yellow. Some people call this warm. I say it's fairly neutral, even leaning cool for my palette overall. I just find that it's a great staple. I've used it a lot for the Garden Tober tutorials and just kind of general beginner tutorials. It's a great staple, but I consider it similar overall. I can get similar effects to transparent yellow, except because of transparent yellow's deeper, rich saturation, I tend to go for that one. Next we have Winsor Lemon. Now if you were here when I had my previous palette and kind of before I did this transition in my palette and my pigments, you know that lemon yellow is one of my loves. I love a cool tone yellow. This is no exception. It's been a great staple. I honestly haven't used it as much since I've fallen in love with transparent yellow, but it's a nice, very cool toned yellow and handy to have in my palette. Next up, we have our first green, Sap Green. Sap Green has been one of my staple greens. It's the first green that I had in a watercolor palette, and I used it for everything. I love how it can be very warm and lemony, and I love how you can make it much cooler, and it gives you a great variety. If you're a beginner and you want one green, I recommend Sap Green. I think it's great. Next up we have Jadeite Genuine, which is a mineral color, so it doesn't have a pigment code because it is directly from the minerals. I love this rich, deep color. I don't know, there's just something about it I love. Something that you're going to realize throughout this little tour is that I love a deep, saturated color, and this has a lot of rich, deep saturation, but it mixes well with other colors as well. I don't know, it's one that I really love. Not a lot of people have it, so I don't use it a ton in tutorials, but I just love it. I think it's beautiful. Next we have Hooker's Green. I don't use it a ton, but it's really versatile and has been kind of infamous in the landscape painting world because you can get so much variety within it. I prefer Jadeite Genuine because it's a little bit deeper. Next we have probably my current favorite, Perylene Green. It's one that I talk about a lot. I've used a lot in different tutorials. I really enjoy this one. Again, very deep. I find that there's a lot of variety with it, but it also instantly creates this moody look. So I really enjoyed that lately for really all of my paintings, but definitely for landscape paintings as well. This is one that I will probably be switching out. This is Phthalo Turquoise. Again, I kind of go back and forth between whether or not I want to keep this. I'm thinking about adding Cascade Green in here. But when I started this palette, I really wanted to experiment more with the phthalo colors, but I just don't use them. They're just not really in my artist color palette. I know people who love them. They're very bright and rich. It's just not for me. Next we have Cerulean. Again, I've gone back and forth between the Daniel Smith and the Winsor & Newton. I haven't really found that I love one more than the other. It is a classic stereotypical sky color. If you're going for a nice sunny day, Cerulean is a great one to work with, but it doesn't have kind of the deep richness that some of these other blues have. Then we have Winsor Blue. Again, this one is similar to kind of the Phthalo Turquoise, and so probably for the same reason, I don't use these two very much, and that's kind of why I'm thinking I'm going to keep the Winsor Blue, so I'm probably going to get rid of the Phthalo Turquoise once I find another green, which shouldn't be hard. I love greens. One that I do reach for quite a bit is Ultramarine Blue. This one is been kind of a staple, partially again because of my job. It's one of those that's included in most paint kits, and so I usually feel safe using it. It also has a nice deep tone to it. Overall, it's very rich. So it's one of those that I find pretty easy to use and have kind of played around with it quite a bit. Next is French Ultramarine Blue, which you'll see has the same pigment code and looks almost the same. Again, while I was kind of jumping around playing with which blue is my, ride or die, which one do I love, which one do I want in kind of my limited palette, and I wanted to see if French Ultramarine, since it was part of the professional line, was better than just the Cotman Ultramarine. I haven't found that I love it more, but at this point they're just kind of next to each other hanging out. Next up we have my other favorite blue. So I have Ultramarine in my minimal palette and Indian Throne. Indian Throne is similar to my other favorites in the fact that it's so saturated. It is so rich. It is so deep. It is so pretty. I really like this. It definitely has a little bit of a purple lean, which I actually don't mind. But if I want something that has that true rich blue, that's when I'm reaching for the Ultramarine Blue. However, I really like how this can get dark and moody really fast, especially if I have a lighter color. So if I'm going for more like a sap green, I'll pull in the Indian Throne because it will get really rich and it will kind of it'll give me those deeper values that I'm looking for. Next up we have Winsor Violet. I'm not a purple person. I usually want to mix my own if I do want to use purple, but it is nice to have it here. I find it to be a good, rich, medium tone purple that is very neutral, meaning that it doesn't lean too blue or too pink, in my opinion. Next up we have quinacridone magenta. My understanding is that quinacridone means that the pigments within it are synthetic, and that actually means that they're more reliable. You'll also notice that I don't have any other magentas on here. I'm not a cool tone red or pink person. Most of my reds are neutral or warm because that's just kind of my preference, and that's just what goes best with my palette. Next up we have Permanent Alizarin Crimson, which I switched to permanent instead of the traditional alizarin crimson because this is staining and it's more Lightfast. So I enjoy using alizarin crimson. I don't use it very much anymore, but I'm glad to have it in my palette because it is a kind of a staple that a lot of people will have. Next up is my very favorite red. This red breaks kind of my usual rule of having like this deep saturated color. Quinacridone red is a very warm tone red, but it doesn't have kind of those deep tones that like Indian Throne and Perylene Green and even Transparent Yellow have. It's kind of, you get what you get, but I love it. I love the way it mixes with the other colors that are in my palette. I just find it so versatile. It's so easy to get the colors that I want. I just love this red. It's definitely my favorite. I like the other ones, but this is the one, if I had to only pick one, it'd probably be this one. I just love this one. Next up, we have Winsor Red, a great staple. I found it really represents this primary color well, and it's one that a lot of people have. It's a nice neutral red. It has a lot of, you're able to get nice and deep with it, but it mixes well and plays nicely with other colors. I think it's a great staple. Next up we have Scarlet Lake. This is a bright, fiery, warm red. I actually love this. I never would have picked it up, but a friend gave it to me and I think it's great. I've used it in a butterfly tutorial recently. I really enjoy it. I think it's a great one to reach for if you're just looking for that bright, punchy red. I can't wait to use this more in the future. Next up is the perfect Christmas red. Hands down, the best Christmas red, Deep Scarlet. This used to be my very favorite red of all time. It doesn't have some of the pinky, warmy tones. It's definitely a little bit more saturated. I really love this color. I reach for it every fall and Christmas time. I'm itching to use it now that I've swatched it again. It's just so rich and deep. It has a little bit of kind of some brown undertones to it, but that gives it a little bit more sophistication, a little bit more character. Next up is a newer one for me. It's Perylene Maroon. So Perylene Green over here, Perylene Maroon over here. I was thinking while swatching it that this would be a good contender for like a Christmas red if you're going for a little bit cooler and maybe a little bit more of a vintage vibe, a little more desaturated. I don't reach for it a ton, but it's one that I've kind of played around with and I'm glad that I have in my palette. Next up we have Burnt Umber. This one's a great one. I find it to be a good, rich, neutral brown, and if I don't feel like mixing one or I need so much that I don't want to mix that much, it's usually the one that I go for. And last but not least is the only orange in my palette, Quinacridone Burnt Orange. This one for me is kind of interchangeable with like a burnt sienna. I also like to do occasionally like a two-color painting where I would use a color like this, like a burnt orange or a raw sienna, and something like an indigo or maybe an Indian Throne. So in that case, I want to keep this around for that purpose, but otherwise I'm usually mixing my own orange, which is why there's only one. Last but not least, I have Ivory Black and Chinese White. These are just your standard black and white. I keep them up here. I actually have white kind of scattered throughout because sometimes for a project I'll need it to be clean. And so I'll just squirt a little bit out in these extra sections. So I try to keep my blacks and my whites over here, except in this lower corner I have some dish soap to use if I'm working with masking fluid. So I just kind of keep that down there, and that way it's segregated from the rest of my palette, but it's always available for me. If you want to know more about that, I'll have that video linked somewhere up here. Anyway, I hope that you found this video enjoyable, that it was helpful. If there are any colors on here, or if there are colors that are not included in this palette that you adore, it does not mean that they're bad options. They just don't fit as well with my specific color palette. And that doesn't mean that it's good or that it's bad. It just doesn't fit as well. I love pink. I just don't ever paint with cool tone pinks. Pretty much never. I have this on here for those few situations where I do. I have a couple of friends, their magentas and their phthalos are their main colors. But if you look at our artwork, you can tell, like, it's not a bad thing, but their styles are different than mine, and the palettes that they end up with are different than mine, and that's a good thing. It's part of what makes us unique, where we can kind of share and learn and expand, and maybe you'll try this color and you'll really love it like I did, or maybe you'll try it and wonder why I fuss on about it all the time. Anyway, I hope that this was helpful and entertaining, that you enjoyed hanging out with me today, because I certainly enjoyed hanging out with you. I hope that you're having a wonderful, wonderful day, and until next time, happy painting.